With the announcement of the Moto E, we have yet another phone from Moto's camp that really tackles the lower price tier market, but we already had a pretty good one in the Moto G, so how does it stack up to now what is considered its mid-tier counterpart? Well, let's find out because it's Josh Vergara from Android Authority, and this is the Moto E versus the Moto G. Both smartphones have very similar aesthetics, especially on the back of the device where the only real major difference seems to be the Moto E's lack of a rear flash. Now both devices do employ soft touch plastic for their backings, however I will say that the plastic on the Moto E does feel a little bit less soft, if you will, compared to the one on the Moto G. And also that quality idea does rear its head again as the buttons on the Moto E are definitely a lot squishier compared to the much meatier and stiffer click found on the Moto G's button layout. On the front, the Moto E has a smaller 4.3-inch display with slightly thicker bezels. It also lacks a front-facing camera and has a different speaker design with a front-facing unit found within the silver bar on the bottom. The Moto G's back speaker was a point of contention for a number of consumers who expressed a desire for a front-facing iteration. Luckily, Moto listened and brought it to the Moto E. And in terms of the body size, the Moto E is a little bit thicker, but it still weighs roughly the same as the Moto G. And also staying true to Motorola's motif of customization, the backs on either device, in this case the Moto E is what I'm holding, will be replaceable with what are called Motorola shells. And they will come in a bunch of different colors. And I also will say that the Moto E's backing is slightly easier to remove than it was on the Moto G. So for such a low cost, the Moto G was actually very durable, but the Moto E continues that with a display protected by Gorilla Glass 3 and also an anti-smudge coating. The entire handset also has a small advantage here thanks to its splash resistance design achieved by adding a P2i coating. Moving on to the screens, the Moto G features a 4.5-inch display with a resolution of 1280 by 720 and 326 pixels per inch. Now while the Moto E's display isn't nearly as good as that, its 4.3-inch QHD, now that's 540 by 960 resolution, is still one of the best in its class as it comes in with 256 pixels per inch. Whereas 720p resolution in the Moto G's display certainly does well in common media situations, the lower resolution and the size of the Moto E display will simply only get the job done in the overall viewing experience. If you're looking for a little bit more out of your general viewing experience, then you might want to consider the Moto G in this particular case. As we move on to performance, we find that the Moto E features a 1.2 GHz dual-core Snapdragon 200 with the Adreno 302 and 1 GB of RAM. But in contrast, the Moto G offers a 1.2 GHz quad-core Snapdragon 400 and the Adreno 305 instead. Now the Moto E may actually be the first place that we've seen the Snapdragon 200, and if you felt the 400 was only decent in performance, then you knock it down a peg and you can pretty much get the idea of what the performance is like on the Moto E. While the Moto G's processing package is certainly stronger, both of these devices should provide a decent overall experience that is considerably above anything else in their respective pricing classes. And when it comes to basic use such as flipping through apps and loading web pages, the Moto E really isn't that noticeably slower than the Moto G. But when it comes to heavier apps and multitasking, we suspect the Moto E will probably find itself struggling a bit more than its slightly bigger brother. Both handsets take a no-frills approach to hardware, and it is the reason why both are able to be priced so aggressively. The Moto E has a 1980 mAh battery that they say can deliver all-day life. Considering the smaller, lower resolution display along with the lower spec processor, the handset should offer at least a comparable experience and likely more when compared to the 2070 mAh battery found in the Moto G. When it comes to the sound experience, the Moto E does get a little bit of a nudge in the right direction here, considering that the rear-facing speaker of the Moto G does get covered up when you have the phone down on a table or really when your hand is covering it. Moto did listen and put a front-facing speaker on the Moto E, but with that being said, it's not necessarily a very spectacular performer. It really does just get the job done, but having that speaker up front is a bit of an enhancement and is a feather in the cap of the Moto E. And while a version of the Moto G capable of LTE connections is coming, both of the phones that I'm using in this comparison stick to HSDP8 connectivity. Though the Moto E has just 4 GB of storage versus the Moto G's 8 or 16 GB options, the Moto E does hold an advantage here over the original thanks to its microSD card slot, affording it up to 32 GB of additional storage. Now, like the Moto G, the Moto E features a 5 megapixel camera on the rear. The big difference in this case, however, is that the Moto E ditches the LED flash in order to keep the costs low. The Moto E also lacks a front-facing camera, while the Moto G does offer that in 1.3 megapixels. The camera app is essentially the same as the Moto G, offering things like auto HDR, easy focus, and some exposure controls. Now, the picture quality on either lower tiered offering won't be very exceptional, as is what we would kind of expect here, but Moto did make it clear that the 5 megapixel optics of the Moto E have been optimized as much as possible to provide a reliable experience despite its space in the lower priced market. And finally, in software, like with the Moto G and the Moto X before it, you do get a version of Android in the Moto E that is near stock in many ways. Of course, there are a handful of special Motorola apps, such as the Motorola Assist for intelligent control options, and the Motorola Migrate for making the move from an older device. The Moto E does bring at least one new software feature that doesn't currently exist on the Moto G, called Motorola Alert. This app is designed to make it easy to share your location with friends and family, or when leaving places. Essentially, on both of these devices, you get a version of Android that is about as stock-like as it can get without buying a Nexus. And with the promise of future updates, at least to the next version of Android, these two devices right here are probably the easiest entry points for anybody out there looking for the best Android experience at a budget price. And so, there you have it. While the $129 unlocked price of the Moto E is definitely its biggest selling point, the Moto G isn't much more expensive at $179. But does that mean you should be going for the Moto E? Well, that remains to be seen, considering what you would need out of your smartphone. Paying the premium for the Moto G does get you a better screen resolution and a faster processing package. On the other hand, Moto learned a couple lessons and put a front-facing speaker and expandable storage on the Moto E, but such features may pale in comparison to what makes the Moto G a more premium offering. What is clear in this comparison is that if you know anybody that still hasn't made the leap to smartphones just yet, well, Moto has their back with highly accessible, highly affordable offerings of Android that are fit for any budget. And so there you have it for this comparison of the Moto E and the Moto G. Given that their price ranges are actually not that far apart, it is a kind of a toss-up for a lot of you out there. If you want the higher resolution of the Moto G and its slightly better processing package, then you can obviously go for that. And also, the version of it that is capable of LTE connectivity might be more enticing to you. But if you really just want a bare bones, very core experience that is reliable and should be able to give you a nice experience either way, you should be able to go for the Moto E, and it will not break your bank. So keep it tuned to Android Authority for all of the best coverage, including our future coverage of the Moto E and Moto devices beyond. And also remember to check out the content from my colleagues in Android, Joe, Jace, Kevin the Tech Ninja, and Lon. So keep it tuned to Android Authority for all of that. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and then head on over to androidauthority.com because we are your source for all things Android.